In Hollywood's golden age, some stars missed the most important day of their lives, their own weddings. What forced them to vanish when love stood waiting? 10. Montgomery Clift, the groom who vanished in silence. Montgomery Clift was one of Hollywood's most magnetic yet tortured souls. The press adored his quiet charm, and women across America dreamed of marrying him. But beneath that polished exterior, Clift was a man who lived in emotional chaos. When he was supposed to marry his longtime fiancée, a socialite connected to the studio circle, he never showed up. Not because of arrogance, but fear. Monty's life was split between public expectation and private struggle. He was battling deep insecurities, substance issues, and confusion about his identity. The night before the wedding, close friends recalled him drinking alone, pacing, torn between his love for her and the prison of Hollywood's image machine. By morning, the guests were seated, flowers perfectly arranged, and the orchestra ready. Yet there was no groom. The studio rushed to silence the scandal. Newspapers printed scheduling conflict as the excuse, but insiders knew the truth. Clift disappeared into isolation for days. That incident marked the beginning of his downward spiral. He avoided marriage entirely after that day, fearing he'd destroy anyone who got too close. His friends later said that Montgomery Clift didn't just skip his wedding, he ran from the idea of happiness itself. His absence that day wasn't about shame or betrayal. It was about a man too broken to stand beside love, terrified that his darkness would ruin the light he adored. 9. Greta Garbo, the star who refused to say "I do." Greta Garbo wasn't just a Hollywood star, she was a mystery no one could decode. During the height of her fame in the 1930s, she was engaged to John Gilbert, one of the era's biggest romantic idols. Their on-screen chemistry in films like Flesh and the Devil was electric, and fans desperately wanted their love story to end in a fairy tale wedding. Everything was arranged: the date, the venue, the dress, the press coverage. Gilbert was ready. The guests were waiting. But when the ceremony began, Garbo simply didn't appear. No phone call, no explanation, just absence. Gilbert waited, humiliated, his heart broken in front of everyone who mattered in Hollywood. Garbo later told a close friend, "I was not made for marriage." That wasn't pride, it was fear of losing herself. She lived by the phrase, "I want to be alone," not as arrogance, but survival. Garbo knew that once she married, she'd be trapped in an image forever. The devoted wife, the smiling public figure. That wasn't her. Her decision ruined her relationship with Gilbert, who spiraled afterward, both emotionally and professionally. Many said he never recovered. Garbo's choice haunted her for years, yet she never expressed regret. She believed some souls are meant to love deeply, but from afar. That unspoken wedding became one of Hollywood's most painful legends, proof that even the brightest star can be consumed by her own shadows. 8. Clark Gable, the king who couldn't be there. Clark Gable, the king of Hollywood, lived a life larger than any of his movie roles, but his third wedding, to actress Carole Lombard, was supposed to be different. It was love, not publicity. Yet fate had its own cruel timing. When the day came, Gable wasn't there, not because of scandal, but because the studio literally owned him. At that time, Gable was under a strict MGM contract, and Louis B. Mayer refused to give him time off for the ceremony. Imagine that, the most famous actor in America being denied permission to attend his own wedding. Lombard was furious, but knew Gable's career was on the line. So, the ceremony happened quietly, without the groom's grand entrance, without the public glamour he deserved. Hours later, Gable joined her. Exhausted and angry, signing the papers in a small, rushed gathering away from the spotlight. To the press, it looked perfect, but privately, it was heartbreak wrapped in Hollywood gold. Their marriage, though short, became one of the greatest love stories in Hollywood, until tragedy struck. Lombard died in a plane crash during World War II, and Gable was never the same. He blamed himself, saying, "I should have been there for her from the beginning." It's haunting to think. The man who played Rhett Butler, the symbol of undying love, couldn't even attend his own wedding as fate began weaving its cruelest story. 7. Judy Garland, the bride who collapsed before the aisle. Judy Garland's life was a masterpiece of brilliance and heartbreak. The studio called her America's sweetheart, but off-screen she was suffocating under fame, drugs, and exhaustion. When she planned to marry director Vincente Minnelli, everyone hoped it would be her fairy tale moment, a chance for peace. But the morning of her wedding, Judy was found unconscious in her dressing room, collapsed from a mix of pills prescribed by MGM's doctors. The wedding had to be delayed, but the press was told she had fallen ill. In truth, she couldn't even stand. Hours later, after emergency care and studio persuasion, she insisted on proceeding. She didn't walk down the aisle like a joyful bride. She was carried there, trembling, half-conscious. Technically, she attended, but emotionally she wasn't present. She later confessed she remembered none of it. MGM covered the entire incident, desperate to protect their Golden Star's image. The irony was brutal. Judy had sung "Somewhere Over the Rainbow," dreaming of escape, yet even her wedding was another performance she couldn't control. Her absence wasn't physical, it was spiritual. Her body was there, but her soul was miles away, trapped in a system that owned her. The tragedy of Judy Garland's wedding wasn't just what happened that day, it was what it symbolized. Hollywood celebrated her as a bride, while quietly destroying the woman behind the smile. 6. Errol Flynn. The groom who wasn't invited to his own show. Errol Flynn was the definition of wild charm. Swashbuckling hero on screen, scandal magnate off it. When he decided to marry actress Nora Eddington in 1943, the studios panicked. Flynn was knee-deep in legal battles over assault allegations, and public opinion had turned sharply against him. So what did Warner Brothers do? They banned him from his own public ceremony. Imagine that, one of the most famous men in the world, forbidden from attending the very event meant to clean up his image. The wedding was held quietly at a courthouse, with a stand-in ceremony staged later for photographs, Flynn appearing only for publicity stills. The truth was hidden from fans. He wasn't there when vows were exchanged. The studio didn't want reporters showing up, fearing protesters or scandal. Flynn, humiliated but too proud to show it, joked to friends, "Even my weddings are acting gigs now." But that joke cut deep. Hollywood's bad boy was trapped by his reputation, unable to separate his real life from the legend he'd become. His marriage with Eddington was short-lived, filled with tension and endless tabloid wars. For Errol Flynn, missing his own wedding wasn't just bad timing, it was a perfect reflection of his chaotic, uncontrollable life. The man who once made millions cheer couldn't even control his own love story. 5. Elizabeth Taylor. The bride who woke up alone. Elizabeth Taylor was Hollywood's ultimate symbol of beauty and chaos. 8 marriages, 7 husbands. Yet one wedding remains a haunting mystery. When she was set to marry British actor Michael Wilding, everything seemed calm on the surface. But behind that glittering smile was exhaustion, grief, and confusion. Her first husband, Conrad Hilton Jr., had left her shattered, a violent, unpredictable man who turned their honeymoon into a nightmare. So when Wilding proposed, Elizabeth saw it as escape, not love. The night before the wedding, she broke down in tears, confessing to a friend that she didn't want to go through with it. But the press was waiting. MGM had already printed the headlines, and backing out wasn't an option. On the morning of her own wedding, she couldn't even get out of bed. Doctors were called in, sedatives given, and the ceremony went ahead without her conscious participation. She was barely awake, physically present, but emotionally gone. Afterward, the papers called it a quiet and graceful wedding. But those who knew her said she was like a ghost that day, beautiful, silent, lost. Later, Taylor admitted that she didn't even remember the vows being said. It wasn't love, it was obligation. That haunting image, the most desired woman in the world, missing from her own wedding in spirit, defined Elizabeth Taylor's early years. She would marry again and again, searching for the one thing Hollywood never gave her: peace. 4. Charlie Chaplin. The groom who fled his own ceremony. Charlie Chaplin, the man who made millions laugh, was hiding a life of chaos behind that little mustache. By the time he decided to marry actress Lita Grey in 1924, he was already one of the most famous men alive and one of the most scandalized. Lita was only 16, pregnant, and Chaplin was terrified. The studios warned him that if the story broke, he could face prison under morality laws. So instead of a grand wedding, they planned a secret one in Mexico, fast, quiet, and far from American reporters. But when the day came, Chaplin didn't appear. Hours passed. Lita waited in tears, convinced he'd abandoned her. Finally, his assistant arrived, dragging a pale, trembling Chaplin into the dusty courthouse. Witnesses said he looked sick, almost haunted. He signed the papers mechanically, without saying a word. He couldn't even face the reality of what was happening. Hollywood's biggest genius, reduced to a frightened man running from scandal. The marriage that began in secrecy ended in disaster. bitter divorces, lawsuits, and humiliation. Chaplin later called it the worst mistake of my life. But it wasn't just a bad marriage. It was the day he realized fame had stolen every ounce of his freedom. He missed his own wedding not by distance, but by heart. The man who made love stories immortal on screen couldn't even live one of his own. 3. Marilyn Monroe, the bride who disappeared before I do. When Marilyn Monroe was set to marry playwright Arthur Miller, Hollywood expected a spectacle, the bombshell, and the genius, beauty, and intellect combined. But behind that fairy tale illusion was chaos. Monroe was struggling with insomnia, addiction, and crippling anxiety. Hours before the ceremony, she vanished. Miller panicked. The guests whispered. Studio agents were making frantic calls. Marilyn had locked herself in a hotel bathroom, refusing to come out. She was terrified not of marriage, but of being seen as a decoration in her own love story. For hours, she cried alone, repeating that she wasn't good enough for him. Her makeup artist finally coaxed her out, and the ceremony went ahead, but by then she was emotionally drained. Photos show her smiling, radiant, glowing in her white dress, but those who were there said her hands never stopped trembling. Technically, she made it to the altar, but mentally she was gone. She wasn't Marilyn. She was Norma Jean. Again, the insecure orphan girl terrified of losing love once more. Miller adored her but couldn't save her. Years later, he confessed that on their wedding day, he already saw her slipping away. Monroe's disappearance that morning wasn't rebellion, it was a cry for help. The world saw a beautiful bride. In truth, it was a woman trying to hold herself together long enough to say, I do. 2. James Dean, the groom who never made it. James Dean's story is one of the greatest what-ifs in Hollywood history. Before his death in 1955, he was secretly engaged to actress Pier Angeli, a love story so passionate and tragic it's still whispered about today. Their wedding was planned quietly, away from the cameras, but Angeli's strict Italian mother disapproved of Dean's wild lifestyle. On the day of the ceremony, Dean was racing to the church, determined to defy everyone and marry her anyway. But when he arrived, it was too late. The doors were closed. The ceremony had already ended, and Pier Angeli was married to another man. Her mother had forced her to marry Italian singer Vic Damone instead, to preserve the family's reputation. Dean sat outside in his car, watching photographers crowd around the new couple. Witnesses say he lit a cigarette, stared in silence, then drove away without a word. That image, James Dean sitting alone in his car, watching the woman he loved marry someone else, became one of the most haunting legends in Hollywood. Weeks later, he told a friend, "She was the only one I ever wanted to marry." Months later, he was dead. He didn't just miss his wedding, he missed the chance at the only real happiness he ever had. 1. Rudolph Valentino, the groom who died before the wedding. Rudolph Valentino was the first great heartthrob of silent cinema, the man every woman in America dreamed of marrying. His romance with actress Paula Negri was the stuff of legend, fiery, dramatic, and unstoppable. They planned to marry in 1926, the most glamorous wedding Hollywood had ever seen. Invitations were written, reporters prepared, and Paula's dress was already being fitted in Paris. But days before the ceremony, Valentino collapsed at a New York hotel. What began as stomach pain turned into a fatal infection, peritonitis. Within hours, the world's greatest lover was dead at just 31. When the news broke, chaos erupted. Thousands of women fainted outside the funeral home. Fans committed suicide in despair. And Paula Negri, inconsolable, rushed to his body, screaming that she was his wife, though that they had never made it to the altar. The wedding that was supposed to unite Hollywood's golden couple became a funeral for an era. Paula wore black for months, calling herself Mrs. Valentino until her death. Rudolph Valentino didn't just miss his wedding, he became immortal because of it. His death turned love itself into legend, and no star after him ever captured that same haunting, fatal glamour. In the end, all these stories from Garbo's silence to Dean's heartbreak prove one thing. In Hollywood, even love isn't real until it's destroyed. Behind the fame, the red carpets, and the perfect smiles, these stories remind us that even legends break. Some ran from love, some were destroyed by it, and some never lived long enough to say, I do. In a world built on illusion, even weddings became performances, and sometimes the leading star never showed up.